So welcome to session A for this time slot, the Youthiverse, Digital Dynamics for Young People, Radicalising to Extremist Violence. So I am, if you know either of us, obviously not Emily Corner. I'm Helen Young, hello. So we've got three speakers today, Olivia Pay, Jade Hutchinson and Steve Barracosa. Jade has unfortunately been caught in a lift malfunction, but he's on his way up. So Olivia, we're gonna run with the papers in order of them being listed. If Jade's still on the stairs at the second paper time, then Steve's we'll just swap that order. Okay. So first we have Olivia Pay, please.
Oh no. Oh no. Is there another? I don't know how to. Where's my?
Do we have? Sorry, who's doing the tech? Yes, great. No, you're not doing tech. I don't know where. Hang on.
She'll get there. There we go.
Oh yeah, great. Thanks.
Are you finding your presentation?
It's okay.
No. Yours. Yeah, no. Sorry. People. Does the speaker mode work? I'm not quite sure. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly. I just have to download a presentation real quickly. Thank you. Sorry. No, was music. Okay, thank you. Yes, introduce everyone. Yes, and then you can go. Okay. All right. Sorry about the delay, everyone. There was people blocking people getting upstairs, but you guys have all seemed to be stuck up here, so sorry about that. So welcome to the session on the Youthiverse, Digital Dynamics for Young People Radicalising to Extremist Violence. So we have three absolutely stunning presenters this morning. We have Luigi Pay from UCL, who happens to be working on a project that ANU and UCL are running together. We have Jade Hutchinson, sorry Jade, at Macquarie University, and then we have Steve Barracosa from Youth Justice New South Wales. So each presenter will go in the order I've just run out, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Are you ready? Yes. Okay, cool.
My God, this is a bit high for me, but sorry. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Lu Jia. I'm from the Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London in the UK. And yeah, today I'll just be presenting my research as part of my PhD thesis, hopefully, just with a particular focus on how these pathways kind of unfold over and across this digital environment, and how do we make sense of what young people are doing online, and are we really able to kind of separate these meaningful signals from, we have a vast amount of noise nowadays. Okay, so just some background. First of all, youth radicalization is not new, but it has sort of fundamentally changed because we all know that young people today live half of their lives online. So, which means that their identities, their emotions, their relationships are being constructed online. And when this happens, extremist actors are more likely to take advantage because now they can kind of reinforce what their idea is or what the narrative is. So the key message here is that we sort of have to map the youth-specific pathways and understand how they are reshaped and how these pathways are being kind of accelerated by the online dynamics. So just some research questions. So first, what psychological, social, or structural process kind of shape youth pathways to violent extremisms? What are the factors and how does it kind of evolve from stages to stages? And second, how do the online environments amplify and accelerate these pathways? How does it help to be like an influencer, or how does it speed up the process or slows down the process? And thirdly, what protective mechanisms also disrupt or kind of slow the process? What are some prevention techniques, or what are some buffers? And lastly, how do the online and offline elements kind of interact in this single pathway? So basically, you can see the last question kind of ties everything together, because it matters, because young people today, they don't just live on either online or offline, meaning we can't really separate them because they move continuously between the two. So here is a very traditional and boring Prisma graph. I hated it so much, but so basically I just started my database with 5,000-ish articles, and after this inclusion, exclusion, duplicates removed, I have 72 studies included for the final review. And just to mention, I have a second coder throughout the way just to make sure the iterator reliabilities and everything. And luckily we had a high number, or else I have to do it again. And what I did was a thematic analysis. So basically I went into each paper and I kind of extract what authors' opinions are on certain themes. And here's the finding. So I kind of divide them into 4 big domains that kind also structure the findings. And each theme has each big domains have recurring themes across the entire literature. So first we have psychological factors. These are the national or group identifications, uncertainties, attitudes towards violence, and also negative identity framing. And next, we have social factors, and these are just more straightforward. It's just social connectedness and disconnectedness, and both online and offline social exposure. And third, we have structural and experiential factors. So these are illegitimacy of authorities, perceived injustice, and demographics, and probably prior victimization. And last but not least, these are just buffers and protective factors. And also we have, I did other findings list, meaning some articles, they sort of talk about this, but not big enough to be a theme itself. So this all goes under the other section. And all these domains kind of interact with one another. They are not just risk variables, but they are processes in which kind of appear on the way to the pathways to radicalization. So here is, I don't know if you can see, hopefully, there's a result of the findings on the number of studies addressing each themes, and just giving time. So I'm just gonna focus on the top 5. So that being perceived injustice, social disconnectedness, online social exposure, social connectedness, and group identification. And I will go in detail of each. Okay, so first one, perceived injustice. This is more of a catalyst, or so basically experiences of discrimination or unfair treatment. And by saying unfair treatment, it can be big as on the social levels. So for example, financial disadvantage, but also it could be unfair school treatment. So when individuals are being bullied or marginalized, they are more likely to feel vulnerable to narratives that frame the entire world as kind of oppressive. And this factor is particularly powerful when the injustice is from state authorities, by saying so meaning police, immigration services, court, law enforcement, etc. In this instance, they are not alone, they are not isolated. It can be a very systemic oppression when these are being kind of validated by peers and communities in both online and offline settings. And next, we have social disconnectedness. So the key here is that young people who feel isolated or marginalized in their offline lives, they are more likely to seek belongings. But by saying someone is socially disconnected doesn't mean that they are just being alone by himself or herself. It's more about there's a lack of meaningful social ties. So youth from weaker family ties, or youth who are experiencing peer rejections, they are more receptive to extremist ideologies. And this happens when the online communities kind of come in and substitute for the absence of these offline ties because they sort of offer recognitions and also validations. Why so? Because young people today, they kind of compensate through belonging strategies. So they are constantly looking for people or organizations that will accept them. So in these settings, all these extremist groups and communities are feeling like shelters, are feeling like homes for them, which makes them feel safe. And next, the online exposure. And this is a major accelerant. So the algorithms, the memes, the peer sharings, they'll amplify the content and creates this echo chamber. So the online community tries to reinforce and normalize these ideas by giving likes, by giving forwarding to apps like Instagram, Snapchat, Telegram. So this factor is particularly powerful when it's combined with offline grievances and disconnections because they sort of accelerate the process. So just imagine someone in school is having talks with his or her peers about, I don't know, how to bomb the school, how to do mass shootings. When school finish, when they get back home, they can still talk to each other on apps. They still have access to internet and everything. So this places them in this constant reinforcement because they're always exposed to these memes, to these videos of violence. And next, the social connectedness. So young people don't just join extremist space because they are looking for an ideology. They join because they are looking for people. They are looking for meanings. They are looking for attachment or identity belongings. So a strong relational ties from peers, from siblings, or from close friends, they kind of act as an emotional infrastructure. That's how I name it. Because they give meanings and they give belongings, they give this sense of stability. So we always see examples when, let's say, two kids or two individuals being together, and one guy kind of normalizes the attitudes for another and becomes like the moral model for the other person. And that happens quite often. So the key is that belonging drives belief, and because they naturally adapt to the norms that they are being exposed to. But again, all this depends on whether the connection is negative or positive. We can stay connected with one another, but maybe our connection is negative. Maybe we are always talking about how to set up a bomb, how to do violent actions or anything. So, and in these cases, it's obviously not a positive reinforcement. And last but not least is the national group identification. So a strong identification itself is definitely not inherently dangerous, for sure. And it can actually be a buffer against radicalization if this identity is positive. But when the group identification is framed as under threat, it becomes really powerful. So individuals adopting rigid identities is seen as a defense mechanisms against probably, so for example, cultural homelessness. And this creates us versus them mentality, so the in-group and out-group. And this is also what I think we have been talking about yesterday as well. So this entire thing also depends on the narrative framing, and this can be really amplified by the online communities because they tend to reframe the local or smaller discriminations as a part of a bigger global struggle. And when this happens, individuals who have a strong attachment or strong sense of belongings will have more responsibilities. They will feel I have to be responsible for the group. I would have to kind of fight against theirs to protect my people. So here is an integrated online and offline model I kind of created. I don't know, it makes sense to me. So this model captures how the radicalization kind of unfolds over the digital and also physical environments. So at the first stage, I would say like at the first step, individuals experience identity uncertainty or emotional insecurity. So they are not necessarily looking for extremism on the first hand, but they are looking for meanings. They are looking for attachment because now they are kind of at a stage where they don't know who they are. They don't know where they belong to. And this moves to the second stage where they search online for answers and belongings and explanations. And this is also when the algorithms kind of direct them and echo chamber creates. And under this online space, narratives usually appear through the humor pictures or photos. So memes, games, it doesn't necessarily to be explicitly ideology first. And on the next stage, they will find peers who validate these feelings, or peers who kind of appreciate what he or she has been kind of feeling attached to, because they will need assurance as well. And at this stage, they also spend more time in communities, and their group norms kind of shift away to, again, reshape their worldview. And on the next stage, this is also when personal grievances are being reframed again as a collective threat, as part of something that's bigger. So now there's the us versus them mentality, and they also move from the mainstream platforms to the really specialized ones. So we can see it as a big cultural and then the subculturals they are in. And this is also the stage where violence will become really rational and even necessary for them. And the last one is when the daily experience kind of being reinterpreted through the radical lens. So any personal crisis, any confrontations will act as a trigger. So the key here is that this entire model is a loop. It's not a straight line. And all these factors will kind of interact with one another, and they can be really influential at any point of the stage. And each of these cycles also narrows down the alternatives and deepens their attachment to the group. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that youth radicalization is inherently hybrid, and we can't really separate online and offline because they reinforce with each other. And in terms of prevention, the offline trust networks are still important, because if we have a reliable and stable offline networks, people tend not to seek other belongings online or on the online communities. But again, if the offline world lacks stability and understandings, they were more likely to accept the online narratives. And lastly, also the developmental timing matters, because we all know adolescence is at a very unstable stage, because they have emotions, they are wandering around, they don't know where they go to. So we really need someone who are reliable to be there and kind of be supportive as well. And the next step on my research is to have a Delphi study, which will prioritize the online mechanisms and also identify if there's any intervention points that we can make. So if anyone's interested, please do let me know. Right, okay, that's all for me. Thank you. Okay. How do I turn it?
Where's the thing? Oh no, it's not me. No.
Where's my little mouse thing? Don't need to hear me figuring this out.
Steve?
Yes.
Jay.
Jade.
Steve's over.
Like that? Must be that one. It's the only one.
That looks like me.
That looks like you. Okay.
There's a clicker here as well, or you can just do the traditional.
Traditional price.
Sorry for the delay.
No, no. Sorry. Well, good morning. Of course, a warm thank you to Emily for facilitating this conversation, and to the Avert team for giving me an opportunity to speak with you all. Let me just, that's why it's always good to check. There we go. Over the last 18 months, I've been involved in a series of projects looking at online youth radicalization in Europe. focusing specifically on children and adolescents under the age of 17 years. And today I'm really presenting a more concentrated body of work. This has to do with a 3-month fieldwork project that I conducted in the Netherlands late last year. I really wanted to know, how do professionals in the Netherlands observe and respond to online youth radicalization? What are the operational challenges that they face? How can their experiences be converted into policy and practice recommendations or reforms? And of course, what can we learn from all this? I adopted a socio-ecological approach to conducting 50 semi-structured interviews. All that really means is that I made a very intentional decision to not separate out any of my interviewees based on their role or their area of expertise or their domain or the setting that they operated in. Essentially, I would just want to talk to everyone in this room. And then I want to find out who is not in this room and then talk to them too. The idea is try to get as holistic an understanding as possible.
All right, thank you. Sorry, thanks.
This involved clinicians from public and private health, secondary school teachers, primary school teachers, social workers in youth and adolescent clients, people specializing in radicalization, terrorism online, media and communication, sociology, men and masculinities, adolescent development, computer science, public governance, public administration, criminology, criminal youth justice. I also spoke to parliamentarians in the Netherlands and also at the continental level. I was interested in speaking to the private sector. I had the chance to speak to a few people who are involved in producing artificially intelligent product or services for national security purposes. Civil society leaders and their organizations primarily focused on providing wayward adolescents and young men with the support that they need to get their life back on track, as they liked to tell me, and also personnel from different national security, counterterrorism, and intelligence agencies. Essentially, beginning with ideology, moving to technology, and then progressing through to addressing some of those operational challenges. The most prominent concern by far across the entire cohort was online manospheric viewpoints. I needless to say, describe it to you all, and I'm sure it's not necessarily a shock, but things like extreme misogyny, male supremacy, especially within the Dutch context, LGBTQ sentiment, pseudo-social Darwinism, which I'm happy to get into if you need to, and something a little bit more dramatic was the increase in references to sexual violence as being jokes or edgy entertainment, with adolescent males in particular seeking to impersonate, to mimic certain influences like Andrew Tate with this very showman-like dominance displays. Interestingly, the closer that the professional got to the young person in question, the greater the acknowledgement was that the young person didn't necessarily understand the information that they were communicating, with some practitioners saying to me, there are performances of being the alpha dog. They sometimes referred to as the law of the jungle. They very soon want to be retired and driving a Lambo in Dubai. Not that any of us want to do that either, I'm sure. One teacher even said that on some of the screensavers, among the 12-year-olds that they were teaching, they had things like Sigma male written on there. They said it was what they see online. It is copied straight from TikTok from Andrew Tate. It's not even their words. I know that this is somewhat challenging, being in a world where we really do focus on ideology, but it did seem like, to me, hearing from the professionals that spend a lot of time with children and adolescents, that the views that they were expressing were just trying to meet some kind of socio-emotional function, some need around attention, belonging, status, control, trying to feel like they are of value to their peers without necessarily having the maturity to know what they're saying. Are they really just performing? Are they just seeking attention and not doctrine? It's a hard question. I don't really know, but it does point out a very important disjuncture to me, that there's a growing over-securitization of youth radicalization, and we ought to re-center optimal youth development and the developmental realities that young people are experiencing in this very digitally mediated age. There was a prevailing reflection and a quandary among a lot of interviewees. Is this dichotomy between security and development false? Is there a way that we can have growth-orientated prevention, a way that we can detect signs and invest in their relationships without making them mutually exclusive? Is there a way to leverage the immense resources that sometimes stream through prevention communities to build more optimal adolescent and child development circumstances. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this next slide because I think this is relatively obvious to most of us, but a lot of the commercially available software products like Meta are rapidly shaping the lives and minds of young people. And professionals increasingly feel like they have very little control over the way that young people are exposed to this kind of content. Specifically, anything other than English content reporting was considered basically unresponsive to professional requests to remove extremist content, and as well as the general sort of corporate attempt to avoid accountability or culpability when it comes to their products causing immense harms like radical shifts in beliefs about themselves and the world. One clinical psychologist working for the Dutch law enforcement characterized the cognitive profile of the cases that he personally worked on as being extremely exacerbated by the software designs of online gaming platforms, increasing, ratcheting up things like rigid conviction, a sense of strong social ambiguity, and sensory sensitivity, all things that they felt like were, again, exacerbated by the products that they were using. But of course, this is not just software, this is hardware. Smartphones are increasingly labeled, as they were in my study, as pseudo-friends, as battlegrounds, as funhouse mirrors for young people. They're not neutral tools. They seem to be inseparable from the outcomes in youth lives that we tend to care about. And they also provide a kind of perpetual connection between themselves and extremist communities. Educators and youth social workers in particular said that these smartphones were focusing addictive tendencies. Sometimes young people were treating them like sacred objects and even ready to aggressively protect their relationship to those smartphones, whether they were challenged or not. I happened to speak, as I mentioned, to a couple of people in private industry who reminded me of the importance of shared infrastructure, that whole Internet of Things thingo. And they said that things like smart devices, like smartphones and Wi-Fi routers that often come together in the same building, places like schools, they tend to, in their words, send a particularly strong signal to those companies who are then responsible for placing certain content in front of the children that we're talking about. Fortunately, the nationwide legislation banning smartphones in the Netherlands has, in their words, considerably improved the situation. However, enforcement is inconsistent across schools and between classrooms. Something that a lot of participants wondered about is whether this school ban was actually sufficient to avoid the very foreseeable developmental effects of excessive smartphone use after the child returns home. So what happens there? So now moving on to, in the time I have remaining, to talk about more specifically some of those operational challenges, and perhaps in some ways they could be transferred here to at least play with. Almost every interviewee mentioned a kind of institutional gap in support that they felt like was making their job a lot harder when it comes to the obligation to prevent online youth radicalization. In the Netherlands, it's thought of that the prevention community is quite distributed widely, and this sometimes created confusion about who was responsible for what, resulting in role fragmentation and overlooking opportunities to provide care. Of course, the closer that this gets to shared and very time-sensitive settings, like within schools, disharmony can be a foreseeable but really consequential condition to applying prevention measures. Frontline practitioners and teachers really responded to this call to be frontline practitioners. They took it very personally, at least the people in this study, that they were some of the first lines of defense when it came to detecting and deterring signs of radicalization. However, they also felt a sort of paralysis, a kind of institutional fatigue. They really wanted to own up to this, but they weren't really sure whether they were being structurally supported to do so. More than that, the signs that they felt like they saw were intermittent, they were generally fleeting, and they became increasingly difficult to categorize bureaucratically. So how do you keep track? What kind of record do you keep? And as one teacher said to me, we're basically told to always be alert, but not necessarily how to deal with it. Backline professionals, like many in this room, also describe feelings of being disconnected from those frontline settings, often wanting more time with frontline practitioners to better understand what their operational challenges are. This mismatch between practitioners and frontline workers seem to really encourage a lot of frontline workers to just improvise, to just try something in the moment to see whether or not it worked with the young person that they were dealing with without review or improvement, documenting defensively or sometimes not at all, and quietly sort of waiting for encouragement from management or their other colleagues, feeling almost deterred entirely from engaging in the problem because they felt like they couldn't really maturely manage what would it mean if I actually highlighted this child or teenager as being at risk. What would happen to them? I don't know if I feel like I can take on that responsibility, right? It's a lot of pressure. So moving on to some of the strategic leverage points, one of the most consistent lessons that I gathered, although there are many from this study, is the importance of that relationship between youth and tech, right? Kids don't just live alongside tech, the effects of their relationship live inside them, much in the same way as when you think about what you are is what you eat. That's not a vague metaphorical truth, right? That's a hard literal fact. And every experience that a young person has with their smartphone is also rendered very physically somewhere in their body, often the organ that helps them make future decisions. So this study often supported a reframing of online youth radicalization as being a developmental and a relational process. Again, it's not much of a surprise in this room, but it needs to be really focused on how it's embedded and conditioned by their relationship to tech. Rather than being separate entities, really I see that relationship as being component parts of the same system. They're evolving in real time in response to each other. And this is not a mutual coexistence. We know that these companies that are responsible for these products don't have our young people's future in mind when they're building them, aside from attuning them to better use those products. And Australia is, of course, moving in the right direction through e-safety and the various bills that are being put forward at the moment to try to mitigate the harms of spending a lot of time with these technologies. Although I must point out, and as far as this work in the Netherlands made me realize, there are much more ambitious opportunities available to us to not just see the software as the problem, but of course the hardware that carries it. And these technologies are just products that can produce very predictable developmental harms. It's not just about incidental media effects or the possible exposure to extremism, but about redesigning the relationship between the people who want to try to help children to live better lives with these technologies, to avoid outcomes like radicalization, and doing so as efficiently and as supportive as possible. One practical strategy is, of course, just to try to reduce the amount of time that young people spending these very high intensity online experiences by more analog, casual, boring ones. Many civil society organizations and people that I spoke to were just desperate to support. They really just wanted to be recognized. Like, we too feel like we can really contribute. And if only schools were a little bit more trusting and a little bit more willing, we'd be happy to provide the services, the manpower. People are willing to volunteer in order to provide children with those spaces and places. A little bit more broad and a little bit more high level. Perhaps there's a way to bring together a lot of these factors that is not necessarily dependent on ideology or security approaches, something like a youth well-being impact index or measure, something to help us better understand how this relationship is evolving over time and learning from it when it comes to calibrating CVE approaches. Lack of capacity was another very prominent theme that came out. And again, I don't know you, but I'm sure some of you have felt the tension when it comes to your workplace and wanting to contribute and not necessarily feeling like you might have the time or resources in order to do everything that you want to. I know I do. But some of the actors that I spoke to, they really just wanted someone else. They didn't want to be told, oh, we're going to provide you more support so that you can do more with less. But they wanted someone else to be in the room. So again, an idea that came out of this study was something like a youth media liaison, someone who attends to several schools within a state, someone whose job it is to just think about and help to produce weekly or monthly briefs for different schools, telling them about online trends, trying to demystify the whole online youth culture thing, and saying, look, if you're a parent, perhaps try this conversational technique. If you're a teacher, trying to keep an eye on some of these things, just someone else to help supplement that instead of saying, oh yes, you're, by the way, our first and best attempt to avoid some tragic futures. Of course, digital media literacy is very popular and people are relying on it heavily. The more contextualized it becomes, the more important it seems to be, not just pointing out the potential misconceptions that people can have with information, but how did that information arrive in the first place? Something that almost everyone I spoke to wanted to know more about was commercial incentives. How did this technology arrive in our hands to begin with? Perhaps investing a little bit more time in professional development to point out things like behavioral modification techniques, surveillance capitalism, product design. It would just probably be useful to know about this stuff anyway, considering how important all of these devices are now. And lastly, adjacent communities of science and practice. Anytime you speak to a large group of very eclectic professionals, the more you want to try to bring in those professionals into important spaces where they can contribute their insight and wisdom. And of course, this depends on very relational and mentorship models, but the Dutch are doing their best to do this. There were two great examples I came across, Dare to be Grey and Emancipator. They are two organizations, civil society organizations that really focus on wayward young men and teenagers. And they feel like they could contribute immensely to this conversation, both in what they know, practically speaking, but also some of the practices that they use that are very economical compared to some of the other approaches that I came across when speaking to people at the higher levels of academic and policy. So is there things that we can learn from that? Perhaps the Dutch experience challenges us to expand the network of prevention organizations. And I know that especially in New South Wales, there are already things like the Compact Alliances that help to do that. But there are also other organizations, and I'm very much not a neutral promoter of this organization, but Talk to Me Bro does immense amount of good work as well and mimics a lot of the things that Emancipator and Dare to be Great do. They are not provided with any support or really any acknowledgement of the work, prevention work that they do. And it's sort of been me having to point out to them just how many benefits come from providing space for people who feel desperately alone and even sympathetic to some of the things that they see online. I'm actually ahead of time, which never happens. So there are a couple of questions that have emerged from this research and something that I'm continuing to pursue here in Australia. Things like, how can Australian CVE more effectively distinguish between developmental behaviour and early signs of radicalisation that isn't entirely dependent on expression or the details of the ideas that they say? How do we incentivise frontline and backline staff to take heed, to borrow practices from adjacent communities of science and practice, having spent some time in addiction sciences or around people who practice in preventing or mitigating addiction? There is an enormous amount of wisdom and practice that can be brought over directly, let alone some people from those industries or communities are very willing and would like to participate, but don't feel like there's really many professional pathways to do so. What programs in healthy masculinity and empowerment of boys and teenagers are available? What further research could be tailored to better signal that these interventions are not just about targeting manospheric ideas, but about providing the conditions so that they may develop into healthy adults for whom I'm sure we will eventually share the room with. And I know that there's some people in this room who have been doing really fabulous research to try to find out how healthy masculinity can be provided for. How can we create those avenues for professionals to learn from case studies, or near misses, as they were sometimes referred to in this study? Again, people who are interested, who are willing, who are on the front line, who feel like they have the capacity and the interest in order to pay particular attention to the things that they're seeing in the young people in their charge, not necessarily sure if they have access to simple things like case studies. How have other people in the past reacted to the situation that you're in? Something as simple as an online anonymized database. I'm not sure. I'd have to rely on someone in the digital humanities to better signal how to structurally set that up. But if there are any teachers or principals in this room and they feel like they want to pursue that, I'd be happy to try to workshop. And just to finish off, of course, I mean, none of these ideas, I think, could be possible without the great help. And I feel tremendously grateful to collaborate with a number of people, including those on the screen and those in this room. Thank you for listening.
Let's try again. We good then? Is it in presentation mode? It's not. I don't think. That one.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Jade and Louisa, for setting that up for me. It feels inevitable when we walk into CVE and CT forums at the moment. There are two big ticket items that we're constantly talking about. I'll caveat this by saying I wasn't here yesterday. So if these things weren't discussed, this introduction is not going to land at all, but work with me on that. So the first is the idea that we are operating as researchers, as policymakers, as practitioners in a climate of incoherent, mixed, do-it-yourself type ideas and ideologies. And I think that feels like a bit of a given right now. I think we've done a pretty good job in Australia and New Zealand, particularly through all of the YAMHAG members in the crowd, of creating a conversation that's pushing the boundaries wider to think about the different ways that young people are engaging in extremism with ideology as less of a hook than it might have been previously. I think Momo and the crew from Vic Uni have done a really good job through the YPIM protocol at creating this narrative of extreme ideas and interests, which has a really nice youth feel to it. I'm going to add an extra layer to that rather complicated conversation because I think we're now confronted with a cohort of young people that are using and consuming extremist content and rhetoric that have next to no interest in the ideological components of the violent extremist landscape whatsoever. And I think they're coming at us hard and fast in a bunch of different ways right now. That interfaces in some really ugly ways with the Southport incident from the middle of last year. So some of us are probably watching on as that review gathers pace and as information kind of seeps out on the back of that. So a violent, fixated minor with huge psychosocial vulnerabilities, poorly understood clinical complexities, I think is probably fair to say, with a very clear footprint in the violent extremism landscape, without any compelling evidence that that individual is actually radicalised, motivated or committed to an extremist ideology, if that makes sense. So if we thought the conversation around ideas and interests and do-it-yourself extremism was getting messy, I would argue that this user and consumer cohort is going to pull us in some really uncomfortable directions moving forward. I'm going to take us a little bit into research and then back out into some observations in practice to see if we can marry those two things up in relation to users and consumers. My research was here in Australia focused on a sample of at-risk and radicalised youth referred to CVE services. I feel like most youth radicalisation researchers feel the need to apologise for their small sample sizes, so I'm going to do the same thing. I think I get around it, though, with really granular detail. So I was lucky enough to have holdings from health, child protection, education, law enforcement, the Children's Court, youth justice, and a youth-specific CVE program that worked with these young people. So we had a code book that was saturated. We had granular details about all of the experiences and vulnerabilities that these young people went through in their lives. And I think it allowed us to try and push the narrative that we must focus when we talk about youth on so much more than the extremist behaviours that they exhibit. So the emotive, confronting, threat or risk-related behaviours, it's easy to get drawn into them, but I think if we continue to focus there, we get this wrong with youth. So we must broaden our thinking. We must see young people as so much more than just their referral reasons, which is often posted this on their Facebook page, did this on Twitter, made these threats on a school computer. There's so much more to this story that we need to get our hands on. So that life course picture around why are young people vulnerable to ending up here to begin with? And when they got here, why were they vulnerable to going even further down that pathway? I think we can bring so many non-extremism clinicians and policymakers and researchers to the table because we don't need to fixate on extremism to get this right. overall, the picture that was painted in that research, and I don't think it's groundbreaking, which might seem like a strange way to reflect on my own research, but the idea that young people are complex and that they have lots of vulnerabilities in different domains in their lives that are all mixing and meshing together to create some unhelpful behaviours and unhelpful life trajectories. I'm not sure that's the most awe-inspiring outcome, but the details tell us that whilst there are outliers, unstable family dynamics, fractured family relationships, attachment issues are pretty common in samples of at-risk and radicalised youth. That tends to transition into behavioural issues in school. For a lot of my sample, as early as primary school, so detention, suspension, in some cases expulsion. I think we learn a little bit about protective factors here, where we love the idea of getting people back to school and taking them to the job centre and doing job interviews with them. Most of my sample were at school. The most radical, the most violent had jobs, and none of those things buffered their risk of trajectory into this space. So I think the genuineness of commitment to schooling and the genuineness of investment in employment is probably where the protective factor lies, but this kind of surface level, get the kids back to school, is probably not making a massive difference. So we could get our hands a little bit dirtier when we think about our case management frameworks. Mental health, it's borderline the new buzzword in the CVE space when we talk about youth. Again, too simplistic. So mental health conditions don't necessarily correlate to violent extremism risk. So there is a little bit of work for us to do there to understand the impact that either neurodevelopmental conditions or mental health conditions may or may not be having on a given case. Naturally, social marginalisation, identity deficits, and a history of violent and delinquent behaviours were quite common before extremism became a concern in relation to most of these young people. I think this gets really interesting when we start to look at how this looked and felt online, and particularly for this user and consumer cohort. So a quarter of the sample on our final analysis we found probably weren't radicalised, but were rightfully referred to CVE programs, but were categorised as users and consumers, not radicalised youth. They tended to be fairly unsettled and unstable in terms of their upbringings. They tended to have very few protective or nurturing attachments wrapped around them, particularly when compared to the radicalised cohort. They tended to have behavioural problems, so they were quite non-compliant with teachers, non-compliant with parents, often isolated, generally marginalised in a social sense at higher rates than the radicalised cohort. Scary reality is most of them had very pronounced histories of interpersonal violence, weapons possession and use long before they ventured into the extremism landscape. So there were concerning behaviours at play before extremism started to do its thing. Some abuse and trauma when compared to the radicalised cohort, high rates of child protection reporting, and emerging personality disorder traits and queries about neurodiversity in a lot of those user and consumer cases. I think it's the online behaviours where things get really, really funky and a little bit messy. So when we compared the cohort of users and consumers with the radicalised cohort, and bearing in mind that that radicalised cohort included minors convicted for terrorism offences in Australia, users and consumers intentionally sought access to extremist content at higher rates than the radicalised cohort. So one of the findings from the research was that the first time these young people were exposed to extremism, over 2/3 weren't actually looking for extremism. So whether it was an algorithmic enhancement that dropped it on their laps, whether it was a friend that jumped over their shoulder at school and said, hey, you need to see this, a message on Telegram, they weren't at that very first moment where vulnerability and extremism started to interact. They weren't actually intentionally seeking to get their hands on extremism, but this user and consumer cohort, they absolutely were. So they intentionally sought out spaces online where they could find violent extremist content. They were also consuming, without question, macabre, violent gore and other objectionable content at higher rates than the radicalised cohort were. Scary findings is that the users and consumers displayed comparable rates of an online footprint of extremist symbols, the production and dissemination of extremist materials as radicalised individuals did. So again, no ideological interest or commitment, but looking and feeling pretty much the same on the internet as radicalised kids were. So I think it poses massive questions around signals and risk factors and the work we're doing in online spaces where what we may be seeing could conceivably belong to young people that aren't radicalised at all, but are using violent extremism in a bunch of different ways. This cohort was also coming to the attention of law enforcement at the same rates as young people who were on the cusp of being charged for terrorism offences. So again, resource outputs are starting to spill out in a bunch of different directions. The good news is they certainly didn't have in-person associations that took this from an online to offline space. And for the most part, throughout the duration of those cases, they didn't seem to develop any inkling for the extremist ideologies that they might have been exposed to. A couple of cases to exhibit this. One interesting and one that I still have nightmares about, but we'll get to that. The first is a young male that we picked up in a rural area a long, long time ago in practice. Mostly stable formative childhood years, relatively engaged at school, socially active initially in his childhood. Parents were a little bit chaotic and there probably wasn't a sufficient level of pro-social modelling and boundary setting. His parents separated at age 14. He struggled with that, really struggled to adjust to living with extended family, experienced periods of depression, and we saw behavioural issues at school, so non-compliance for the first time and a disconnection from his previous academic activities. So some of those protective factors were starting to soften. Living with an auntie and then living with Nan, receiving no supervision online whatsoever. So basically doing as he pleased, often through extended periods of suspension from school. In terms of his concerning behaviours, he would go to school when he wasn't suspended and openly show his friends ISIS beheading videos at length, even when those kind of advances were rebuffed by individuals. He would hand in homework with swastikas drawn on the top of that homework and naturally incurred the attention of the principal and local law enforcement in this particular rural area. He'd often show videos of right-wing terrorist attacks to other individuals at school. Not a lot of evidence that he's ideologically engaged or interested, but naturally causing a huge stir in that school environment. He'd go home from school in the afternoon and play Islamic State nasheeds at the very loudest level that he possibly could, drive the neighbours crazy, and eventually cause his auntie to send him to live with his grandmother. So what's motivating that behaviour wasn't ideology, but definitely complexity. Unfortunately, he transitioned to making some very direct and targeted threats towards his school setting. You'd often find school computers with the Columbine attackers replaced as the screensaver. Heavy footprint online around times, dates, so quite explicit materials. He had contact with police. It made no difference whatsoever. He was charged for making those threats, but at no stage appears to have engaged in extremist ideology, despite at length possessing, using, consuming extremist content and disseminating for long periods online without any real interest in the cause that he would allegedly have been said to be involved in. Second case, my favourite case ever, but I'm still troubled by it. And there's one other person in this room that probably still loses sleep over it. So this could turn into a therapy session, but work with us on that. 16-year-old girl, an outlier. Not a lot of us in practice have large caseloads of adolescent females, and thank the Lord that that's the case. I hope it stays that way. Supportive single-parent household, but a strained relationship from her formative childhood years. Early issues around being a little bit cold and callous towards other students, not developing social relationships in school settings. Quite marginalised, quite isolated from her formative childhood years. Diagnosed with anxiety, diagnosed with autism, and allegedly subjected to a period of abuse by a same-aged peer around the age of 11 that she held on to for a long period of time because she grew a grievance with law enforcement for not responding to those allegations of abuse. She became quite resistant to any support that was offered to her, whether that's mental health, whether that's the education setting, whether that's private clinicians. She was very difficult to engage. Almost started to embrace this idea that she was an outsider, didn't belong, didn't fit, and that she was going to run with that. Struggled to manage her behaviours in school settings, and her mum had enough and pulled her out of school. Understandably so. But mum missed the memo where pulling her out of school and introducing her to the idea of homeschooling meant that she also needed to be present for that. Mum went back to work. She left her at home unsupervised for years, where this young individual went deep into violent gore and violent extremist spaces online. So she consumed and disseminated volumes of extremist content that I've rarely seen in any other cases. She developed her own video edits, primarily Islamic State beheading videos, where she'd meshed different videos, different images, different music together, had no interest in ISIS or the ideology behind it, but became the self-anointed queen of the dark web, one of the few females operating in the most objectionable violent gore spaces online. And she loved it. She described ISIS as her fuel, the best thing she'd ever seen. She downloaded jihadist operational kind of like bomb-making manifestos and translated them. Again, no interest in the cause for which ISIS was promoting, but had her hands all over the violent extremist landscape. She incurred attention from police. She threatened a school. She carried weapons. She became kind of quite worried that the government may be following her, and she maintained that grievance with police. So there is a risk profile around law enforcement, around government. We had huge concerns around her risk towards intimate partners and also to children, unfortunately. She returned to school for one day. And on that day, she pulled out her phone and showed her new school peers all of the things that she was interested in online, and was subsequently expelled from school after a grand total of 3 or 4 hours back in a mainstream school placement. Was actually convicted for possession of child sexual exploitation materials. So not for the violent extremist content, but a hard drive was found that contained the most graphic, grotesque materials that exist out there in the ether, most of which came from violent extremist spaces. But she's not radicalized. So again, huge footprint online in the extremism space, but no ideological convictions, commitments, or interests for the most part whatsoever. So very quickly, in practice, what do we see? Lots of clinical complexity emerging, absolutely, over the last 6, 12, 18 months. Huge family systems issues. We have to go deeper into our family systems interventions, whether it's for users and consumers or for radicalised youth. I don't think we're getting our hands dirty enough with families, and there are evidence-based interventions out there that the CVE landscape could do better getting its hands on. Big issues in practice around screening. It's out of the scope of this particular presentation to talk about risk assessment, but this user and consumer cohort spikes on a lot of risk indicators on tools like the Vera, but they're not radicalised. So risk specification for violence, for extremist violence, is becoming very difficult for clinicians. I know Emily's been talking about this for a little while, but what are we assessing risk for? What tools should we be using? And are we traversing a lot of different spaces and probably have no choice but to go with that? We're learning a lot about what violent extremist content is doing to individuals online. I know we're talking about harm broadly, but we're seeing cases where absolutely violent extremist content is normalising and desensitising violence for young people that aren't radicalised. We're seeing some where it's probably a provocation and an inspiration to act out against others, again, without ideological motivations. The 16-year-old female that we spoke about, I'd argue that violent extremist materials was almost an intervention for her. It was self-soothing. She'd watch it to feel better about the world. She certainly felt better about herself when she was consuming those materials. She was pre-764, which is, thank God for that. But in the current climate, we know that violent extremist material is now being used to coerce and control others. So I still feel like there's more learnings for us to go through in this space. Users and consumers in practice appear to be threatening schools at length. Got it. 3D printed firearms, flamethrowers, tasers are coming at us hard and fast in too many cases right now. Edged weapons, as we saw yesterday in Sydney, are all too prominent, and again, a strong footprint in the extremism landscape. Gore and other objectionable materials are swirling around in mixed spaces for this user and consumer cohort online. They're a scary cohort in practice. Opportunities, absolutely, for intervention, for progress. But in terms of risk profiles, we're in a pretty unsettling place, particularly around where some of these users and consumers might take us. And we're also learning a little bit around where this falls into the hate crime space. We've had a big spike of violent assaults perpetrated against individuals from certain sexual minority groups. They're radicalised in some cases, maybe. In some cases, it's hate, but in some cases, that user and consumer feels to be very much at play. So to wrap this up really quickly, it's complicated. It's really messy. And I think it almost highlights how difficult this youth conversation has become in the current climate. But there are probably 3 pretty clear options that have significant implications. But for the sake of the conversation, one would be for this user and consumer cohort, we expand the barriers of youth CVE. And it almost becomes extreme violence rather than violent extremism. And there are huge policy and resource implications around that, but maybe the pre-existing frameworks we have in place could capture this broader spread of extreme violence concerns. If that's not a desirable option, I suppose we need a landing zone elsewhere for this user and consumer cohort, particularly those with violent fixations. The kicker is it can't automatically be the youth criminal justice system because these kids aren't all being charged for criminal offences and we don't want them, in essence, charged for criminal offences. It also can't be the health system because whilst there is complex personality pathology in some of these cases, they're not all acutely unwell. So we can't just throw the word mental health around and think everything's going to get better. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that. If we go with option 2, we need a landing zone, but we need it fast because we will be having a conversation around Southport here in our own backyard if we're not careful, because there are young people in our communities that have the same vulnerabilities, the same propensities, the same risk profiles. It's not just an international phenomenon. So there is possibly a landing zone elsewhere. The third option is the one that I give my children at home all the time. It's do nothing, just see what happens. It's probably not the desirable option, but it is, in theory, an option. And I suppose a lot of us at the moment are thinking of how we would respond to a Southport inquiry from a CVE perspective with youth in our mind in an Australian sense. I don't think any of us really want to go there. So can we proactively find a way to get in front of this increasing complexity? We're probably going to have to, whether we like it or not. So I think that's me for the most part. Thanks for having me. Last time I was here, I'll finish with this. Julian Drugan, last time I was here, it was a couple of years ago, looked at me at the end and went, I should not have invited you. I hope that hasn't happened today. And while some of that content is confronting, we're talking about youth, so there's always potential, always opportunities for progress. See how we go. Thank you, guys.
All right, because everyone ran to time. I think it's because I'm probably a pretty scary person. We've got time for 5 minutes on questions. So I'm going to give the mic to you guys. And then, so if you stick your hand up, we've got 2 mics inside the room and we can go. So, first question. You're right in the middle of the room. So.
My question's for Steve. So I'm Sam. I'm from the Engagement Diversion Program up at Queensland Police, so our CVE program. Just I like sort of what you said about that sort of change in, I guess, that fascination and violence that we're seeing with our referrals coming through. One thing that I've noticed in stakeholder engagements is trying to define that as best as we can for the purpose of the work that we do. And I found that we started getting referrals for people that were just showing more psychopathic tendencies where their intention is murder or violence, but it's on an individual scale. And I'm just wondering if we need to be more firm in our definition around it being more like a mass violence. And I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts around that.
Short answer is yeah, it's tricky. I love the idea of extreme violence. I don't think youth... It's time for that therapy session, I think. I like the label of extreme violence. I think the reality is, though, that youth will never allow us to have this beautiful checklist of what we do and don't do. So I have no qualms kind of aiming for a nice little this is who we are and who we aren't. But I think what we've learned over the last decade or so is that young people aren't going to conform to that so much. I'd rather screen referrals out and redirect them than not receive them at all. So I'm actually okay with people sending me we think he's a psychopathic axe murderer, and then send that in the appropriate direction, then people not reach out. And I wonder whether in the youth space we don't need to be more willing to consume some conversations that maybe aren't in our space to make sure we catch the ones that are and to redirect the ones that we think that aren't. Because I just think youth won't conform to our nice frameworks and our nice checklists. And we do have to try and come up with them, but also concede they're probably not going to work as we talk more about 10 and 12-year-olds. They don't really care what the government comes up with, so they'll probably come at us either way.
Any other questions?
Thank you all. It was a really interesting session. I'm Sue Saltmarsh from UNE. Hi, Jade.
Hi, Sue.
Jade and I are doing some work. It's the first time we've seen each other in human space, not online. I've actually got a question that pertains to some of the latter slides that Jade was showing us about organizations and men's groups that are kind of a landing place where young kids can go and get advice or support or have somebody to talk through these issues. And I'm wondering what kind of oversight there is there, because I'm just, you know, from a risk perspective, I guess I'm thinking you've got vulnerable kids who may be looking for connection, looking for somebody to trust, looking all the kind of things that predatory individuals would probably find easy hunting ground. So I'm just wondering what that looks like in that space.
It's a great question. I can speak to my experiences interacting with and being in some of those organizations here in Australia. An uncomfortable truth is that there is a way to distribute authority within a group that doesn't necessarily require some formal justification for people to do good in those spaces. It's trusting that if a community figure is involved and over time has been vetted by a community for being productive in peering into the lives of people who are feeling disenfranchised and perhaps turning towards pretty bad ideas, that they are responsible enough and trusted enough to do so. It's a very empty answer, and I wish that there were a more structural way to oversee who is involved in some of these organizations and in what way they could be brought over into the early prevention space. And I think that's something that the study in the Netherlands really pointed out, especially those who are already doing immense amount of good and have been doing it for some time, but would just like to be more involved and acknowledged in the various benefits that their work does, including preventing online youth radicalization. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. So, Lucia, your systematic review was specifically the violent extremism as opposed to extreme violence. But given some of the stuff that Steve talked about, oh, sorry. All right. So Lucia's study was focused on violent extremism as opposed to like extreme violence. So looking at the kind of case studies that Steve spoke about. When you were going through the review, were you finding any kind of factors that could be linked to more the extreme violence space, so rather than violent extremism? Because there seems to be, with your work, Steve, there seems to be this conceptual disjunction that maybe does translate into practice, but maybe not. Are you the right person to deal with extreme violence, even because they're still consuming it, even if they're not ideologically engaged? They're still consuming it. So I'm wondering what the research, is there any research out there that you found during your review that could link that way?
I will say yes, but again, what I did with my systematic review was more about when it goes from stages to stages. So it doesn't really necessarily to be extremism at the first hand, because they usually kind of gradually goes from smaller things to the final, the carry out of the extremism actions. So I would say yes, but I can't think about on top of my head, of course, but there are things that it could, let's say it could start with games, it could start with memes. And all this will add to how the individual perceives the violence. And that when they have validations, when they seek reassurance, and that ultimately leads to the real extremism goals. Yeah.
Thank you. Just because, to me, from a prevention perspective, how useful is that ideological distinction if the prevention aim is to stop the behavior? And if the research captures that when looking at violent extremism, do we need to be making a distinction? I'm not a practitioner, so
I mean, I think ideology is just one piece of a complex puzzle for youth, isn't it? So it can't be the anchor through which we do this work. If it is extreme violence, someone still needs to rule out radicalisation and violent extremism concerns. So I don't mind who does the work per se, but it's a pretty broad dynamic picture that needs to be canvassed by practitioners, and it will include threat assessment, it'll include violent extremism risk assessment. It'll need to be underpinned by developmental experience, which I think is really key. I think we've got a lot of content experts wandering around the youth landscape, whereas we probably need more youth experts wandering around the youth landscape that we can capacity build in these conversations. So, yeah, less obsessed with ideology than we've ever been, noting that it can be hugely relevant in some cases. I mean, it's not that we scrub it off the list, but I think you need skillful clinicians that are experienced up the wazoo with youth, with threat, with risk, who are willing to sit with that complexity and also arrive at a final destination where it may not be clear because it's becoming very difficult to paint a clear picture at the back end of these cases. So I just think good clinicians is what we need more than ever before, and less of a hook on ideology, arguably. Yeah.
Momo at the back.
Hi, can I ask two very quick questions? They're both with Steve. Steve, just wondering, with your data, if there's enough there to analyze it quantitatively, longitudinally, because it feels like you've got rich qualitative data. And I wonder if that converts into longitudinal kind of analysis. And the second question is, in regards to your previous slides, option 2, in terms of creating a new landing space, I'm sure you would have heard about the violence reduction unit that was announced here in Victoria. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on whether something like that could play that role, or yeah, that's it.
Look, I don't know how easily that qualitative data translates to quantitative outputs. It just, probably not at the moment. I suppose that's the utopia, isn't having a big enough sample to pack a real punch in that regard. I might ask you what you think of the violence prevention unit, because I'm not probably well placed, but thoughts initially, does it fit as an option 2? You shouldn't have asked me questions, mate. It's coming straight back at you. Does option 2, does it fall into that violence prevention unit conversation? Because I'm not sure. I'm not probably well placed.
Look, honestly, I don't know either. It seems very interesting.
It's been a good chat.
Yeah. The cynic in me is very much like, politically sexy. But I think, I don't know. Look, if I'm honest, I think my first question is, why not just provide funds to, say, school psychs, people working in schools, providing support already in that space? But, that's me.
I think maybe to pick up on a point there, we could probably make this conversation useful. It can't be politically sexy, whatever we do next with these youth. Like, there has to be a genuineness in the resource allocation. It's got to be developmentally underpinned. It's got to be robust, and it has to be meaty and long-term. There are no easy fixes with some of these conversations we're having. So whether it's schools, whether it's an option 2 landing zone, it's got to be a proper commitment to pulling this off, because it is difficult work, I think, is what we're being confronted with right now. So wherever it lands, if it is politically sexy, it fails, I think, is the harsh reality of where we're at right now. So maybe that just caps it off to say whatever we do, it's got to be really genuine, and it's got to have a youth lens attached to it for us to get this right.